Hi everyone, my name is Victor Manibo. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer based in New York. My debut novel, The Sleepless, came out in August 2022 from Erewhon Books, and I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you for coming. And next up is Samit Basu.
Hi everyone, I'm Samit Basu. I'm from and currently in Calcutta in India, and I write science fiction fantasy, and I've been typing enthusiastically for the last 20 years. I also make films and comics.
Fantastic. And then we also have Lincoln Michel with us. How are you?
Hi, good. Yeah, I'm Lincoln Michel. I'm the author most recently of this novel, my debut novel, The Body Scout, which is a kind of cyberpunk book focused on body modification in a near future New York.
And baseball.
Yes, and baseball.
Right on. And last up is Malka Older. How are you, Malka?
I'm good, thanks. Really happy to be here. I'm Malka Older. I'm the author of Infomocracy and the rest of the Centenal Cycle trilogy, which is near future, and also my forthcoming The Mimicking of Known Successes, which is considerably farther future.
And that's out in March, right?
March 7th.
Right on. Well, to get things started, I would like to ask all of you, why is the near future such a compelling space to set science fiction stories in? And Victor, I'll start with you.
Sure. Wow. Well, I think one of the most compelling things about it is its accessibility. It's easy to imagine what's going to happen in a few years. Near future sci-fi, I've always thought, is really about the now, which, most sci-fi really is also about the now, or at least contemporary themes that we want to explore in a different time, in a different setting. But near future is just a lot more tangible, a lot more accessible. It's easier to immerse the reader in it. As a writer, I feel like it makes my job a little bit easier. And as a reader, it's also, it gives me the sense of, well, is this actually happening now? Especially with the speed of technology, it feels like if I read a near future sci-fi book, it's possible that this is already happening and the larger public or I'm just not aware of it. So that kind of tension is also something that for me makes near future sci-fi very compelling.
Right on. And Malka, what about you?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that our sci-fi is very much about the present most of the time. And sometimes you really need it to be closer to the present for people to get, for it to really hit them in the face. I know when I started writing, I was a little bit intimidated by trying to write far future because, and I'm going to go really weird and obscure here for a second, but I know we all love Jorge Luis Borges, and he has this wonderful book called 7 Nights about which is lectures he gave, nonfiction. And there's one in which he talks about having a dream about a person from the past, like an ancient king sitting on his bed. It's like terrifying. And he says, I knew he was ancient because he was fundamentally different from us. And I think that, when you think about really large gaps of time, there's something really different. You have to think that people are in really different circumstances. And so there's going to be something really different in the way they look at the world. And I love reading far future sci-fi that deals with that. And I love getting into it now. As I said, I'm writing somewhat farther future. And it's exciting, but sometimes you really want to be talking about the people now, and you want people to be able to really grasp that link between the consequences, because near future is consequences of today, right? It's what's coming from what we're doing right now. And sometimes that's just super important to nail home.
I agree. And Sheree, what about you?
For me, the near future is like a kind of liminal space of consciousness for us. So.
Oh, we lost Sheree. Okay, Lincoln, go for it.
Well, yeah, I agree with what everyone has said so far. This is kind of, a cliche, but we do really live in science fictional times in which we turn on the news and things that are happening feel like they could be in a science fiction story, or even literally were in one, last year or so. I don't know if all the rest of you had this experience, but when my book came out, there was a few things in it that ended up kind of happening that I was, even put in almost as, satire or hyperbole. So if you're working in the near future space, it is a way to talk about the now and to talk about the things that, probably all of us think about all the time. When I hear about some new technology or some new dystopian, news story. There was one the other day about San Francisco voting to allow police officers to kill with robotic like Boston Dynamics robot dogs. And then there was an outrage and it thankfully got taken back. But, I can't hear a news story like that and not think in a kind of science fiction sense about what that will mean in the very near future. And so I think that's what's the most attractive about it. It's, exploring the things that I'm thinking about now.
And Samit, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, we all know it's not science fiction's job to predict the future. And, science fiction is pretty much always about people and the present, but looked at through a different lens. But when you're doing near future for science fiction, pretty much everything you write is already happening or has happened somewhere else in the world. It might just be a little further from you. And I think we all live in times of, so much difference compounded with so much similarity, because people are essentially the same everywhere. And we're all staring at the same multiple choice apocalypses heading down towards us. And everyone's in this constant state of collective anxiety. So the thing with near future science fiction really is that pretty much everything you're writing is, you don't have to worry about whether it's plausible. Because it's pretty much always definitely already true. So you're on this very exciting edge where you're kind of working with not genre, but every genre all at once, everything everywhere all at once, but kind of turned up to 11, which is what makes it particularly exciting and quite tense to both write and read.
I agree. Nice reference there. That's a very good movie. And Sheree is joining us once again. I'll ask you the same question. Yeah. Why is the near future such a compelling place to set science fiction stories in for you?
I think I just left the near future and I'm back. For me, it's an exciting place because it's a liminal space of consciousness where you're not so far in the future where you have to do a lot of world building to help people get acclimated to the new reality that you're trying to help them to imagine. You have just enough of the now for them to feel connected to it, for it to feel like a language that they can speak confidently. And it gives them opportunity to spend all of that experience as a reader or as an audience member of the film or the play to go with all of the other new things that you're directing them to as a creative, so it is just enough in the future where we can do some, experimentation and to say, hey, look at this. I know we're used to thinking of it from this way, from where we are, but what if this goes on here, right? And you still have some similarities in terms of culture and in terms of political systems or global systems, or at least you have that backstory. If you're diverging from what we know, they have a reference point, so they can feel grounded.
Exactly.
So I don't know whether it's 50 years from now, and we're looking at how children are socialized differently, or if it's how 100 or 1,000 years from now, which I guess in the scheme of things, that's still kind of near future when you're looking at stars and stuff like that. But yeah, it gives you a place to go, and they don't have to feel like they have to be a brainiac necessarily to grasp the things that you want them to experience.
Exactly. And this leads perfectly into essentially my big question, which is what use value does fiction in a near future setting have in terms of what you just talked about, speculation and exploring these big and small ideas, while also extrapolating on the potentials of what the future may hold for us on this planet, or even within our solar system, because that's not even that far future either. Malka, I'll toss it to you in terms of what you feel in terms of the use value of this near future genre.
Sure. I mean, I think it's so important for science fiction in general, first of all, to just give us ways to imagine different futures. And I think that's really important, particularly in near future, because near future, I mean, as a lot of us have said, we're on the edge of near future now. We're practically in it. And if you consider that the future is unevenly distributed, yeah, some of us are in it. So it's very easy for that to get caught up in the present. And it's very easy for people to think of this just sort of unfurling like present, and it's fine, nothing's changing, there's path dependency and things are happening. And I think that we need this reminder that things can change very quickly and decisively and rapidly. We need people to see that there are actions that can be taken that will really change the stories we tell. And and that, you know, people have agency in that. And so I think opening up even the very near future into saying, imagine the different things that could happen that would make this different from where it is right now, whether those framed as a warning in a dystopian sense, or whether it's framed aspirationally in a utopian sense, or somewhere in between. I think it's really important to kind of break the sense of like, oh, we're just kind of floating the stream, and nothing is going to change that. It's not important.
Agreed. And Victor, what about you in terms of your sense of the use value of near future fiction, but also for someone who lives in New York and also wrote about New York, how was it for you to kind of to straddle that line?
I think, you know, near future sci-fi is very interesting, especially in the time that we're living in now, where there are so many forces and so many incentives for us to shorten our attention span. We're all living in the now. Everything is like, we're scrolling through everything instantaneously. You know, TikTok is making people's brains like live in like 5 or 6 second chunks. I think the near future sci-fi just encourages more thinking and imagination of farther out into ourselves and into the future, which Malka was already talking about a little bit. I think as an aspirational exercise, I think near future sci-fi is great. As a lesson, as a, you know, a precautionary tale, it's also great. Although lately I've also been thinking about the inspirational value of sci-fi in general, just because when we see the people who read, let's say, Snow Crash and think, oh, I can make a better metaverse, is that really, I mean, that is inspiration, but I don't know how potent it is when the people who are inspired and who can make changes based on that kind of inspiration somehow take the wrong lessons from it. But just in general, I think it's really important for us to kind of cultivate that thinking more about the future, especially when there are so many things that are forcing us to just think about our next meal or you know, our next task.
Yeah, it's kind of like the transition out of generations who were constructing grand cathedrals over the course of multiple generations, and these ideas that transcended the here and now and thought farther into the future. And now, yeah, you're totally right. We're just in this very now kind of mentality. And that takes away from the potency of and the necessity of being able to look into the future and speculate about these different things that could take place as a preventative measure. It's kind of like, you know, when it comes to medicine, people who are more treating symptoms as opposed to taking preventative measures for the things that could happen down the line. Lincoln, what's your take on all this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what everyone is saying. You know, Malka referenced that William Gibson quote, right? That the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. I think I might have mangled that a bit. But I was thinking about that quote the other day and how you could kind of break that down, right? It's also true that utopia is here, but it's unevenly distributed. We have massive wealth inequality and certain people who are really insulated from the effects of climate change or, you know, automation or any of these issues. And not right at the same time, dystopia is here, but it's unevenly distributed. And so, you know, the issues that we might be thinking about in a near future context, whether it's climate change, you know, climate refugees, how automation and AI and stuff will impact different industries. Like, these are also present questions, right? There are populations who are suffering under all these kind of issues already. So, I mean, this is kind of repeating maybe my answer from the beginning, but I guess the use cases we're thinking about deeply immediate issues, like things we have to be thinking about now in political and ethical and philosophical contexts. And, you know, science fiction is just one way to explore that, because I think for any of these kind of issues, even if we're talking in a kind of political sense, you know, how politicians might discuss them, they still have to extrapolate out a few years to understand, you know, how we grapple with them. So yeah, I think science fiction, you know, if fiction has a use case, this is a good one.
Agreed. And Samit, in your case, just in terms of the way that you represented a place like India, your home, through the city inside, how do you feel about this notion of speculating about the future, but also at the same time representing a culture that people are not, for the most part, within the book industry, intimately familiar with. Obviously, India has a massive population, but you don't see India getting a lot of representation in science fiction. So how do you kind of straddle that line of both speculating about the future, but also speculating and representing your version of India?
Well, I mean, as far as representing India is concerned, I gave up on that before I started because it's an incredibly complicated country that cannot even begin to understand. So I would completely set aside the
Your version
responsibility
of India. Yeah.
of kind of explaining it to everyone else. But one of the lovely things about being on a panel with so many of my favorite authors is that you can just agree with what everyone said before you and in advance to what Sheree is going to say after this. But for me, I mean, but to come back to your actual question, for me, I really live in a part of the world that is on the unequally distributed part of the William Gibson quote that
Yep.
we've referenced now and probably will again. And so when it comes to near future and the use case for fiction in it, it's really not so much about driving the future so much as coping with it. So a lot of my book was about coping with the near future. How does my part of the world survive the near future? And a lot of that was about pivoting and reevaluating all your relationships in a situation where you don't have much control over what big tech is doing, you don't have any control over policy, you don't have any control over what near future is what climate change is going to do to you, the effects of migration, the effects of everything that's going on. So it's kind of you're trying to play Super Mario with life, just jumping from platform to platform, and in the process finding a way to not just survive but also evolve, to reevaluate your relationships with your government, with your city, with the people around you, with the people in your life, with the people at work, just pivoting all the time in your everyday life, under the onslaught of tech and the effects that surveillance and constant distraction and terrible governments have, not just on your life as a person, but on society around you at every scale. And I thought I was writing a sort of, a comedy office workplace drama about dealing with the near future, and yet for both in this country and in the US, when the book came out, everyone said it was a dystopia. So after a point, I just agreed, because clearly clearly this is a dystopia that I'm sitting in. And the thing is, I mean, and I kept talking about how dystopia is a function of distance, because the fact that my everyday normal reality is dystopian to other people is something that I still can't cope with, and and that's going to be the near future for everyone that I will fail to represent going forward.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. Sheree, do you wanna get in on this and kind of extrapolate in terms of your experience in America, but also for instance in the Memory Librarian, the anthology or the short story collection that you contributed to with Janelle Monáe, that the lived reality of the people within that world is probably very different from what most people perceive as normal. You know what I mean? So how is it for you in terms of your lived experience, but also the way you represent it in your stories, and the way that you view this kind of speculative futurism approach to thinking?
I'm just really just kind of struck by Samit's comments. Just he hit it right on the nail. That he just really got to it, because we are living in so many different perceptions of reality. And when you think about, for example, the conversation about climate change, people talk about it as if it's something that's happening elsewhere in the future, when there are whole continents of people who are being impacted immediately by it.
Exactly.
They don't have their ancestral lands, they're flooded, they're the way that they have traditionally, made income and take care of each other is over with. And they're just like the backdrop of our novels, right? Those are the little nameless faces in the background, and that's their reality. Being a Southerner, being a Black woman, being a mother, also, and being African American, Black American, whatever term we're using these days, I feel hyper visible and invisible at the same time. So often, this ideal of our different Americas, right? We are like the bottom of that, right? And so even when I go into other spaces that are, I think, as a tourist is disconnected, I am reminded that that I am hyper visible and invisible and in this world, right? And so that there are a whole lot of narratives and stories that are attached to my physical presence of entering a public space that I have to contend with, even when my mind is on 100 million things beyond that, right?
Mhm.
So that's just a lived experience, going to go get bread in we're in the city that I'm from. I have two home cities, Memphis, New York, right? And you are peopled in a different way, right? So when I think about what are our shared stories, where are our shared values, it shifts like a prism depending on who you're aiming that at. And I think, and I'm probably going to mix it up, but I remember early when I was getting started with Afrofuturism, we were really intrigued by the work of Kobo Eshun and intrigued by Jana Komfra, right? And they were talking about the experience of Africans and her diaspora as being like a kind of first contact story, that you are walking through the world sort of like brother from another planet, because you are being treated in these different ways and being perceived in ways that don't necessarily connect to who you are. And so when I think about the work that we did with the memory librarian, that Janelle really was in, she explored this in her music, this idea of having to break free of society's roles that they want you to have, and the non-regulation parts of your own psyche and your own spirit, and how that can bump up against and challenge and subvert technology and those power dynamics. She played that out in her music and the lyrics and the videos of that. And so for her to want to explore it in a larger kind of context with 5 different writers, right? 4 different writers, right? That was very exciting. I wasn't initially aware of what that world would look like, what I mean, and how it would feel.
Right.
But it became very clear that we wanted to kind of dive into this near future space where there are things that people can recognize. There are traditions and cultures that things people can recognize, but we're maybe in, from different, power positions. So I chose to look at the people with the least, and the people with the least in any society, it seems, is children. They are, the ones who are often treated like property, right? Whether we want to talk about that or not, do children have rights? And I wanted to see this particular world through a family that has been impacted by all the ways that they've been made invisible through this society, the prison industrial complex. What does that look like in the near future, right? And not only that, but the psychological theft that takes place when you're in these kind of toxic societies that use you as fodder for all kinds of things. So the absences, right? Where your people are either overworked, in order to keep, shelter and electricity and the internet or whatever it is going on, or they are their intellectual labor and their creative labor is mainstream, is sucked out, so they don't benefit from any of it. Like all these different ways. So how do children navigate that if they're seeing the people they care about the most under the wheels of this society that's supposed to be so great because of its technology, right? It's supposed to be advanced. It's supposed to have evolved, and so there are those spaces, as Lincoln and Malka and others were saying, that it's uneven, but it's uneven right in the same geographical space, right?
And then on top of that, I like how you frame it as, from these different strata of society, they perceive the supposed advances of the general society in different ways. Technology is unevenly distributed, or at least the use value is unevenly distributed as well. But that applies to a lot of big concepts. You brought up things like climate change and sort of governments and I know in the Memory Librarian, there's a lot of talk of surveillance and the ways in which society is watching you and judging you and deeming what is good and bad in society. And I think there are a lot of these big concepts in near future science fiction, whether it's climate change or artificial intelligence or technology or capitalism and corporations and all these different things. But I feel like the real magic from the perspective of you all as writers is the ability to tread the fine line between perceived reality, or at least a believable reality, and enjoyable narrative. So Lincoln, I'm going to toss this to you in terms of how you feel you tread that line between realistic future and a narrative that's fun to read.
Yeah, I always find questions about like believability and realism interesting, because I kind of like don't worry about that so much. I guess I think the work that impacted me the most when I was like a young reader were works like Franz Kafka's stories, right, which feel to me to better explain the alienation of modern life, or at least life back then, than something truly realistic. And so I know there's often a lot of focus in science fiction circles on world building. I really admire writers who do really rigorous, logical world building, but I don't think I can do that, or it's not my strength. So I tend to go for more of a thematic unity to the work. So I don't know, in my novel, The Body Scout, I was really trying to focus on the body as a central concept, and how the body will be shaped under technology and capitalism in a near future kind of context. And so to me, I think if you can like get the thematic questions right and have an interesting and fun story, readers will go, not worry so much about the believability. Or I guess the believability comes about through the effectiveness of the fictive dream, maybe more than the details. Or at least that's my hope.
I like that though. Malka, what's your take on this sort of dichotomy between reality and believability and enjoyable narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it depends what you're writing about, right? Like very much like Lincoln said, there's some things that you really want to be plausible to make the point that you're trying to get across, or maybe it's not even a point so much as an issue you want to explore. You need to have, I think for me, the best stories work where there's some rigorous thinking around that and it makes sense. But that said, I think part of what we do and what's really important about what we do is being able to imagine things that feel very implausible, but being able to play them out in a way so that the story that takes place in them feels plausible. And to me, I tend to lean pretty heavily on sort of, I think it's important to have the characters feel like people and their relationships feel like they make sense in some people way, which is very much not a mathematical like A plus B, because people are very weird. So, I think characters that have some spontaneity, but also some recognizable personality that they, more or less hold true to, that the way they act makes sense to us as readers, can get you past implausibility of whether it's, a fantasy and a dragon, or there's a sudden deus ex machina, which we try to avoid, but it happens, or there's aliens out of nowhere, and things that are kind of implausible can work as long as we're seeing the characters react to them and react to each other and interact in ways that make us feel like this makes sense. And for me, that's a big part of the enjoyability part too, is I personally like books where I enjoy spending time with the characters. And so I like writing books where I enjoy spending time with the characters. And I know that like, that's me. There's people who hate reading characters or find it really illuminating to read characters that are horribly disagreeable. It's cool. But for me, I like to have characters that I enjoy being with, and groups and friendships and relationships that I enjoy experiencing. And so I think that's another part that's both plausible and fun. So I think it's a mix. I think there's places you can go way outrageous if it serves your purpose, as long as you have, enough of the narrative cohesion that people feel like they suspend their disbelief without worrying about it.
For sure. And Victor, building on that, how do you find that balance in your work, and what's your take on what's been said already?
Sure. For me, just to echo what has already been said, believability is not something I want to preoccupy myself with. I find that it's more of a hindrance than anything, especially when I'm starting to begin to work. When I'm thinking of my top level premises or concepts, believability, I don't even try to think about it. I leave it for my poor editor to like rein me in if necessary. So in terms of process, the concept of is this plausible, at least when we're talking about the world or technology, that mostly comes in well into revisions when I have to do more mid-level research and more refining. And I think this question of believability, at least the way it was asked, is about the world building or the technology. And there's only so much you can do in terms of research and refining and making sure that, this is something that hard sci-fi people will find rigorous enough. Like Lincoln, I don't think that's in my wheelhouse. I don't think I have the bandwidth or the capability for that. I try to make sure that my characters are believable. When I read a story, what takes me out is the implausibility of character motivations, the implausibility of character choices, and so that's really where I kind of want to focus my strengths. With The Sleepless, the premise is a pandemic where, a part of the population does not require sleep. And to me, that's very implausible. I don't think that'll happen, but the way people react to it, I hope, the way the characters reacted to it, I hope is plausible and is believable and is in keeping with how people live now and how our institutions would deal with such a change in the way human bodies work and how institutions will adapt to this new kind of resource that can be exploited, which is extra people's time, right? That's where I really put my efforts in making that plausible. The world, like I was saying earlier, the world of near future New York is kind of easy. I'm playing on easy mode because everybody has a visual idea of what New York is. Even New York in 2043, where this book is set. So the plausibility there for me, the believability was not even that difficult. So I tried to make up for it in making sure that character motivations are clear, that consequences are clear. And I think that's really what makes, to me, a compelling story, near future or otherwise.
For sure. And Samit, what about you? What's your take?
I think overall my take is that this is something that only writers of fiction are concerned with, because if you look at the world around us, nothing is believable, nothing is plausible. No one else feels this pressure to make sense. The news gave up kind of narrative logic a long time ago. Accurate nonfiction description is not plausible. None of it is believable. It's only people like us who are still fools and who still think that, we have to present the truth. We have to present, like, everything has to make sense, everything has to be immersive and plausible. But if you look at how much people's minds have been stretched over the last decade alone, I think people will believe anything. So I really think fiction writers should take it easy. That said, we don't, and we're not going to. So
serious.
So yeah. So and it's also something we take pride in, right? Like telling lies to tell the truth. And making everything make sense in a way that no one else wants to anymore. So in general, I mean, I'm also fairly relaxed about, whether some truly wild concept is going into the work, because I know that readers, if it's just immersive enough, if the people make sense, if the people are true, if something feels real inside it, just, in terms of their emotional arcs, to use a pretty, overused phrase, then the reader is going to be along for it. For the near future book, though, the challenge was that, was trying to imagine what it would feel like to live in about 7 simultaneously occurring episodes of Black Mirror. Because one of the ways that Black Mirror stretches my plausibility is that you don't have just one crisis on one technological on axis. You have 7 of them at the same time, and the challenge is trying to multi-tab them to make your day make sense. So dealing with that was the near future specific issue. But at the same time, I was always conscious that the more research I did, the less the world made sense. So I was always going to be ahead of the curve. I was not worried.
We just gotta take the seriousness down a notch, but I appreciate it. And Sheree, how do you, kind of circling back to you in terms of the dichotomy between believability and, I guess at this point, a consistent narrative, one that's also fun but makes sense?
I think if we're talking about writing, as a reader, if you're invested in the character, if you're invested in what happens to them, then you are willing to journey with them, a certain distance, right? And then I guess for me as a reader personally, it's my connection to those people, who they are, why they move through the world the way they do. What are the stories, the narratives from their lived experience that is shaping them, right? And if you can do hand waving, with the environment, and I'll go along with it because I'm into the people. That's what it's about for me. And so the thing that I guess that strikes me sometimes when I'm reading is like we're in an age now where people are in the DEI. When I was coming up, it was multiculturalism, right? So there's different terms for the same concept, which is all of it basically, how do we navigate living lives in a global white supremacy, or how do we navigate living lives with an economic system that actively undeveloped certain parts of the world, so for it's the gain of others, right? That's that unevenly distributed, utopia dystopia happening, which is baked into our the choices our leaders have made, right? And our choices to allow corporations, particularly in America, to basically run everything. Health system, education system is coming right along. They're really hot to privatize everything. Natural resources, all of that. So when you are looking at choices and what's real and what makes sense, if you're trying to like diversify your work, and I'm going to put in a character who's this person or the character's that person, but it's disconnected from their actual culture, it's disconnected, or you don't give me a story to explain why they are making choices that someone who has this place in society or this experience is going to be making different choices. That's when I start looking at the credibility issue. I'll go with you on your witches and wudges and your digits and dodges and your whatever capitalized technology, lowercase, slang jargon you've created for your new sexy world. But if the people don't make sense, right, I'm going to be wondering, okay, what happened in the dystopic past that has made this human being who you claim is this other thing to operate in these in a very familiar flat way. So credibility for me is about bringing the human spirit on the page and making me connect to them in a way that I'm invested in what happens to them, whether they're the villain or not. I want to know what's going to happen next, and that's connected to how well you can craft a person who feels like that feels like a real person to spend time with,
I appreciate that everyone's coming back to character, because amidst all this talk of technology and big concepts and forces outside of ourselves, at the very least, through your fiction and through other stories, readers are able to, I believe character is one of the big driving forces behind our love of fiction. The ability to inhabit someone else's head and feel the consistency and like the logical consistency, but emotional ups and downs of a character is the kind of thing that helps to enhance one's own empathy. And so it's really touching for me to hear all of this talk of all of you. It's like, yeah, fuck all the research, whatever. Nothing matters if the characters don't make sense or if people can't connect with the characters. And that for me really hits home, because when I read a story, that's what I want. I want characters that I can not necessarily relate to, but get in their heads and understand them and feel this logical consistency over the course of a story, despite their successes and their failures. So I want to kind of build on that and ask all of you if you feel there are, at least within the genre of near future sci-fi, other kinds of creative constraints or some fun challenges that have been presented to you over the course of you writing these stories. So Lincoln, I'll go with you first.
Maybe I can answer that question kind of sideways, because I was just thinking about something Samit said that I really liked about the way that like kind of Black Mirror episodes, or sometimes there's like one technology, and not to rag on Black Mirror too much, but in the real world there's 6 or 7 or 10 or tons of kind of issues that are intersecting at all points.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that bothers me, so I think that was a very great point, but it was making me think about another thing that bothers me about some types of science fiction, and which is that you'll have a new kind of technology or concept introduced to society, and then all the characters react in the same way, or everyone reacts in the same way except the one person who rebels and is the hero of the narrative. And so one way that I try to make character work in like a near future science fiction context is having lots of different characters react very differently to technologies or to new developments in different ways. So like I said, my novel was concerned with kind of body modification in a near future capitalist context. And so a lot of people read that as dystopian, but I didn't necessarily think it was a dystopian book, because I was also showing ways in which these kind of new emerging technologies of genetic editing and advanced medicine and advanced steroids and stuff, a lot of that is very dystopian and will be especially in America's already dystopian healthcare system, will be quite horrible. But there's ways in which it'll be useful for people, to say have more affirmation of gender identity, for example. And then also there'll be people who will reject that technology entirely. And I think so that's one way that I think character can be made really believable in science fiction, is by showing a kind of more diverse, multifaceted reaction to the issues that are being introduced, the kind of speculative conceits being introduced into the world. Because that feels like how reality works to me, right? Some new technology comes along and some of us embrace it, some of us fight against it, some of us use it to rebel, some of us use it to conform. And that's kind of what makes life interesting.
Yeah. And Samit, what about you in terms of creative constraints and fun challenges that have arisen through your approach to writing the near future?
Well, it's actually, I mean, just entirely in agreement with what Lincoln just said. For me, it was pretty much the same, in the sense that I was working with trying to rediscover and interpret the environment that I actually lived in through a displacement of approximately a decade, where people would be roughly the same, but the millions of kind of intersecting threads, and more than the intersecting threads, the divisions that already exist between people would be magnified by just that little extra thing. So every shift in the environment that the next decade would bring here would be magnified. Like body modifications was a part of it. Every stratum of society would experience it differently, and their relationship with technology and the degree of consent with which they embraced technology, or which they chose to embrace technology, or it was forced upon them, or their lives were completely altered by the imposition of technology on them by policy, was a key thing. Existing lines of friction in India, whether class, caste, religion, gender, sexuality, there are many more. Because we have our own special take on every single problem the rest of the world has, and how those would shift in the near future. One constraint that I set myself, and that's why I set it a decade in the future as opposed to 50 years in the future, is that I wanted to work with technology that had already been invented, at least in prototype. So it's not going to be a surprise to me when anything that's in the book comes true, because all of it is going to come true. It's a question of when and where specifically, in terms of its effect on a specific section of society. So I took that unequal distribution part of that code very seriously, because I was literally looking at, okay, this technology exists in prototype in the West, but when it is embraced consensually by the upper class here and forced with complete callousness and lack of empathy on the poor, how's that going to affect people's relationship with each other in the city? Where is violence going to break out? All of that. So it was really about examining examining the details of the world I already live in with a slight shift.
Yeah, I like that. And Malka, what about you in terms of constraints that you faced, but also challenges that you embraced?
So I think like specifically in terms of my book, there were, my near future books, which are actually not that near future, they're like 50 years, but as Sheree said, relatively that's quite near. And I was writing really about geopolitical changes and how things might work differently, and so that created a lot of things to think about in terms of, if we move past this absolutely ridiculous nation state system that we have now, if I'm trying to describe where a character is from, I can't use countries, for example. So I was thinking about, what does it feel like when people's government is not linked geographically, when they're it's not national, but that, their identity as their citizenship is not linked to geography. How do you write about that? And, there's population works very differently because population is critical instead of territory to how these jurisdictions work. So I had to think a lot about populations in the future and how that shifted. So there was like technical stuff like that. But I think also in general, when I'm thinking about near future, what the other two have said already. But in addition, in terms of creative constraints, one thing I try to do a lot is make sure that I come up with extraneous details about changes in the future, stuff that is not related to plot, and doesn't have like necessarily a payoff later in the book, because I just think it's so important when we're world building to show different technologies or changes or shifts in the way people think that have happened that are not totally tied to the story we're telling, because I think it feels very mechanical if everything is attached to the story. So I tried to do a lot of sort of random brainstorming about the world in the future and how things might have changed that aren't, as Lincoln said, aren't necessarily connected to that one single technology or that one social change, or even if they are, just don't have any relevance later to the plot. So I try to do that a lot and think about, I think the surprises and the differences. I do try to push really hard also on social changes. There's a book that I teach in one of my courses, which is not often recognized as science fiction, but it is, which is The Pushcart War. This is a kid's book. It is, everyone should read it. It is actually a wonderful manual for collective action. And it's a book that was written in the 50s and it's set constantly forward. So the book is framed as a history of a war that has happened in the future of whenever you're reading it. They keep changing the dates in the book so that it's always set in the future. Okay, so it's legit science fiction. It predicts a ton of stuff about the way our world works now. But even though it's written by a woman, it does not, it sticks very close to the gender norms of the 50s. And I find that really interesting of this book that manages to stay very fresh, despite the fact that the major conflict, the major conflict is between push carts and trucks. So there's already this old-fashioned feeling to it, but it feels super fresh until you get to one of the parts where they're the mayor and his cronies are like, well, our wives want to go shopping, and if they get in on this, we're going to be in trouble. And so there's this weird, wow, they're already critiquing, plastic bags and traffic patterns and the way that politicians are using their power and their stock accumulations and all these things. But this woman who wrote it didn't go the step farther about the way that gender roles would change. And so she does a little bit at the end. I shouldn't totally say that, but because she does kind of push it a little bit, the whole time it's like that. And so I really think that, even maybe especially when we get pushback about oh, you're just being very, you're trying to cater to one group of society about writing about and people about these different ways. Why can't you just write about people being normal? Normal changes. It has changed phenomenally fast over the past century or less. And, if you think that with all these tech changes, the social structure and the way people interact and the identities are not going to change, that does not stand up to the evidence of the past. So that's another thing I try to push myself up to make sure that I'm not just putting today's people, and especially not just me, but lots of different people, and thinking about how they might interact differently in the future.
and giving them world details that give the reader just like a little extra nudge toward, feeling unified and comfortable in that world. At least, like, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of consistency. It's not only consistency of a character, but also like their relationship to the world. Not necessarily like they have to be directly affecting it or anything like that. It could just be like a one-line detail of like something they saw that the reader's imagination can extrapolate on and immerse themselves just a little bit more. And Sheree, do you want to build on what's been said before, but also talk about your constraints and challenges when it comes to writing in this near future space?
I guess my constraint, looking at these things, is I have a kind of ambivalence towards technology. I guess you could say that. And so when people say, when you're writing this work or creating it, people expect you to be all into the technology. And for me, it's a means to an end. It is a tool. It's a tool that can be remixed and flipped, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the things that I'm curious about are, how are people going to take the thing that was designed for one purpose, right, and redesign it for something else, right? And how do people add that ingenuity to it? And what are the ways that it goes wrong for one group of people, right,
Mm-hmm.
when it was designed to do another thing, right? And so for me, it's the near future isn't necessarily this place that the golden age told us we're going to be at, right? Supposedly, we're supposed to be flying around in the air and doing all, studying, art, music, whatever our skill is, because we have so much leisure time, right? And and none of the technological imaginings that the pillars had early on have come to pass, and that's because the cultural values haven't changed that significantly. And so for me, the challenge is to not give up hope. As Samit was saying, he wants to create the hopeful spaces in the future, in the pockets of dystopia. And for me, it's, especially when you're doing research or you're just turning on the news or looking at whatever's on your news feed and whatever platform you're on, it can be very demoralizing. It can be very discouraging. And so for me, the challenge is for me to think and to at least hope that 100 years from now, 500 years from now, we're not having the same conversations in different fashion. You know what I mean? That's the thing. So, I don't go into it with this kind of, bright and shiny, the stars are our destination. We're gonna get there. I'm looking at how you give humanity a new toy designed to heal or feed or support, and they will figure out how to make a weapon out of it, right? So how do I navigate those spaces? And then also, just to be quite frank, I look a lot at the past. To me, the past is not the thing that you put in a box or you put on the shelf and you say, oh, back in the day, because back in the day is sitting right on your shoulder. Back in the day is peering over your breakfast. Back in the day is saying hello. Do you remember me? We're still here, so it's not this kind of linear thing for me. It's I don't know. We're moving in the future, but we're being pulled back by the things of the past that are impacting our present. We are constantly dealing with that dynamic. So that's the challenge. It's like staying focused, staying hopeful, and not thinking we're just going to become new ultra neo-colonialists who have just remixed, the exploitations of the past into new ways, right? So hope is the challenge.
100%. And Victor, what about you in terms of, finding your balance in terms of these creative constraints, but also the challenges, and building on something that Sheree touched on, the notion that the past is ever present, despite the fact that we've got one foot in the future, one foot in the past. But in the sense of near future science fiction, it's a genre that has existed here now. It will exist in the future, and it has existed in the past. So what do you think about the staying power of this genre in terms of its sort of relevant to life as we are experiencing now. So if you want to touch on the constraints and challenges, but then also kind of transition into the staying power of near future SF. You're on mute, Victor.
I really like what Sheree said about the past and how, hopefully we're not having the same conversations over and over again. And, I think that's one of the constraints that I'm finding with near future sci-fi. The discourse is a constraint for me, or a challenge for me. And it's because books and literature, they're always in conversation, and hopefully, that conversation is intentional. And when you're seeing the same books over and over again, you're having the same conversation over and over again. And because near future sci-fi specifically is about the now, it's all about everybody's current preoccupations. We're all talking about, for example, recently, class inequality. There's a lot of ether-rich books and movies and TV shows. And when I look at it, I try to find is this saying something new? Is this a rehash of past conversations that we're having, whether it's sci-fi or not? But that especially tends to be at the forefront of sci-fi, just because sci-fi tends to be more direct about talking about issues like capitalism and class inequality. So I think the constraint for me is to make sure that if I'm delving into a particular theme or a topic, like, for example, class solidarity, hopefully I'm able to bring a perspective that is traditionally overlooked, something that is a different view of the same conversation, and hopefully something that I'm equipped to deliver. I'm a queer person. I'm an immigrant who moved from the Philippines to the U.S. I am a person of color, and that kind of perspective. I'm from a working class background. That perspective doesn't really get as much discussion in all these, for example, like I was saying, ether-rich stories necessarily, or not as equally, right? So I think that's the constraint, and that's the challenge for me. And segueing that into the staying power of near future sci-fi as a genre, because it's about now and our present preoccupations. I think it will always be a fresh, exciting genre that people will produce, that people will buy, that people will want to talk about. I don't think it's going to, fall by the wayside, that's going to be out of vogue. Just on the very basic level, to rag on a Black Mirror again, tech horror is all, tech horror is always going to be huge, because the fear of unknown is always going to be a thing, and technology, is there has always been tech horror. It just doesn't look like the tech horror that we have now, right? Yeah. So near future sci-fi, or sci-fi in general, I think the viability, to me, there's no question, it's always going to be there. It's just a matter of bringing in new perspectives, talking about the same themes in a different way, or bringing in new perspectives to talk about the same themes.
Definitely. And Malka, what about you in terms of the staying power?
I think, I think that it's a fun and exciting period to write and read about. I think people are always interested in what's going to happen sort of the day after tomorrow. And, I've mentioned a couple of books that I read and care about that are from the past, and writing about the near future of the past. And so I think that there's times when you see things. Okay, so I feel like I'm just constantly citing these random books, but, and this one is especially fun because I can never remember the title, but it's a Lem book, a Stanislaw Lem book. And it's space exploration, and it's a lot of it is about swarm theory. There are these aliens that are swarming, and so they have a consciousness that's multiple, but also so it's very interesting stuff. But they crash land on a planet, and the way that they get out of the rocket ship, because they can't reach the door, is they pile up all their star maps, all their paper books full of star maps, which immediately, when I read it, I was immediately like, whoa, okay. And it kicked me out for a second, but honestly, the rest of the book was great, so I didn't care.
Malka, sorry to interrupt. Is it the Invincible? Is that the book you're talking about?
Honestly, I don't know. I've read a bunch of his books and I get it confused with the other ones. I'm sorry. I haven't read it in a while.
It's all good. Continue.
Because I think the Swarmy thing is probably pretty invincible.
Mm-hmm.
But so anyway, yeah. So, I think that there's, as in terms of what we talked about before with plausibility, like if you have the stuff that makes a story fun and plausible and enjoyable, then even if you lose on some of the tech notes, it's still a good book. And I think that, as we keep going forward, people are going to keep wanting to read about the near future and find it interesting. And honestly, like reading these things in the past, it's also great to have a window into the past and into what people were worried about then. So, I when I said before that my book is like 50 years in the future, so it's not too close. Part of the reason I did that was honestly because I didn't want to be proved wrong too fast. It still happened because a country in Central Asia changed the name of their capital, and I'm just hoping they change it back before we get to the time period my books are set in, which could happen. People change their capitals back and forth. But anyway, so I think that there's always that risk, but also once you have the story that works.
Yeah. And speaking of someone who rose to the challenge of only setting it 10 years in the future, Samit, what are your takes on the viability of near future sci-fi in the near future? Will there always be room for this particular kind of speculative fiction?
See, I've read and loved everyone in this panel. I'm a fan of everyone in this panel. Now, not only are the near futures imagined very different, the lenses used to imagine them are also very different. And all of them are fascinating to me. So the thing is that, the fundamental curiosity about the near future, all other things set aside, the fundamental need for hope, the fundamental fascination of fear, the fundamental, sense of permanent crisis and the urge to know what's next, that's not going away. So, genre definitions keep changing, media keep changing, like publishing trends keep changing. But I think it's fairly safe to say that the need for near future fiction has always been there and it's always going to stay.
Yeah, I agree. Vic, Lincoln, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I don't know. First of all, it's a great panel. I really also love everyone here. And I feel like we're all vibing on the same sci-fi wavelength, which is great. But just, I don't know, for some reason, when we were talking about this, or when I was listening to everyone else talk, I was thinking about the ways, well, this is not coherent. I think what I want to say is that if you're getting like caught in the particulars of like predicting the future on, exactly how technology or things will happen, you're likely to lose out. As Sheree was saying before, right? Like the predictions of flying cars and stuff never came to pass, but we have dramatic leaps in, technology like cell phones. Like you're just kind of never going to know where things go, which is part of why I was saying before that I try not to worry so much about realism in a certain sense, because all the reality is just not going to conform to your views. But if you do focus on these other questions that we've been talking about character, about the way humans operate, about the way ideology operates, I think that's where you can really have staying power. Like to be a little more specific, the book I was thinking about when people were talking for some reason was Orwell's 1984, which, has many things wrong about how the future turned out in terms of particulars. But the thematic concepts as explored, and as distilled into speculative conceits like the 2 minutes of hate or, Big Brother and stuff are still powerful because he understood those questions about humanity rather than the particulars about how this or that technology might play out. So I have completely wandered from whatever point I should have been making. Yeah, it's about, it's not about the believability, but it's about the exploration of how humans operate and distilling that into speculative conceits, I guess.
And that's the kind of thing that will continue to resonate with people, because it's like the shit that we're dealing with is going to be consistently changing, but the people of that time, the writers of that time, are going to reflect that in their fiction, I think, which is kind of like this ever evolving cycle of, you know, society reflecting literature and the authors that are writing that literature, and vice versa. And Sheree, what's your take on all this?
I was just getting ready to move.
Cool. Just get ready to move.
Plug it into the future now so I don't disappear. Yeah. What's my take on what?
On the long-term staying power of
Oh.
near future science fiction.
I think as long as we're alive, we're going to be nosy and curious and want to know what are the possibilities for, you know, other ways of being. It's just, I don't know, for me, the near future as a genre is fun because I love the imagination of the authors, right? So just all of the, like Malka was saying, she likes to imagine some of the ancillary stuff in the background that doesn't have anything directly to do with the plots, but is just part of that, you know, oh, this cool thing is happening here, or, you know, they have different flavors of coffee or whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. You know, we're going to be curious because we take, at least for me as a reader, I take some of those ideas and think about it and go, well, why don't we have that now? You know what I mean? We're always looking to see if we can get to the sun, if we can get closer to the light. Or for the pessimists amongst us, they want to know, you know, how bad it can get, right? Mm-hmm. How bad can it get? And where am I going to be? I remember the kind of smugness that a lot of people had who are, I guess, more engaged with times of scarcity, right? So during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when we were quarantined, right, I had some, you know, former military, some military vets and others who are kind of not survivalists, but just really the outdoor kind of people. They were very happy to tell us how well they were stocked, how mm-hmm. much water they already had, all the different cleaning agents they had, because they had already anticipated, you know, things like this happening, and they didn't want to be caught out there, right? So I think that's going to be a part of it too. We're always just curious. How far can we go as a species? How far can we go as a society? I'm interested in youth culture. I love the innovations of young people and how they change our language and it eventually gets mainstream, right? And how they change you know, our concepts of fashion and how you present yourself in these spaces. And so, you know, works that are exploring near future things like that, I want to know how far are they going to go, you know, what's going to be acceptable and normalized, right? Mm-hmm. So, which means there has to be another impulse to go even beyond that, right? So it's always going to be here as long as we're conscious.
Definitely.
We're going to be dreaming ahead.
Yeah. And from the writing perspective, for all of you as writers, I feel like near future sci-fi, in terms of my perspective as a reader, what makes me feel like the genre is completely fresh over and over again is the ways in which writers genre bend. So I wanted to get all of your perspectives on this. Victor, I know you with the Sleepless kind of blend in this sort of noir vibe, like this little detective vibe, into the overarching narrative. And I feel like that kind of stuff, infusing different genres together, but speculating on the future is another way of keeping this subgenre fresh far into the future as well. So Victor, what's your take on that? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Sure, yeah. The Sleepless is near future sci-fi, and it's also a mystery. And I did genre blend there because as much as near future sci-fi gives me something, an aesthetic, a world, you know, a visual language, it doesn't give me much of a plot, right? Like I can want to live in future New York. It's not going to tell me what kind of characters I want to populate it with. Near future sci-fi or sci-fi in general has tropey characters, you know, like genre conventions. But to me, mystery or thriller or noir just gives me more compelling characters that are morally ambiguous, whose motivations can shift at every turn. So that's why I was really attractive to me to just mash those two things together. I think, going to your question about whether that's a viable way of keeping near future sci-fi vibrant or fresh. I mean, genre blending is great for that, always, for any kind of genre. I think it's being done a lot. I think it's always been done. We just don't think of it in those terms. I think, like I was saying earlier, maybe some genres lend themselves more to the world, some genres lend themselves more to a plot, and people combine that. And when you're working with a novel is never just the one thing. It's never just a romance, for example. Sometimes, a lot of the times, the most successful ones are historical also. It's not a way of, to me, it's not a way of keeping the genre fresh. It's just one mode of actually executing a novel. What makes near future sci-fi fresh to me, again, what's going back to my earlier point, is just the different ways that we bring in new perspectives and new ways of thinking about the future. And sometimes genre lends itself to that, in that, LGBT fiction can be considered a category or a genre, right? Well, I want to see maybe more near future sci-fi that's very, very queerer than, what I've attempted, because I do try to make it very queer. And there are conventions and there are tropes within LGBT fiction, right? So that's, I think, where most of the freshness is going to come from the inclusion of more perspectives from other backgrounds, other settings, and yeah.
Awesome. And does anyone else have any thoughts on this genre bending thing? I mean, for me as a reader, it's like that's something that keeps it fresh. But I like the points that you made, Victor. But if anyone else wants to jump in there on the genre bending notion.
Yeah, I mean, I could jump in, and I mean, I thought of my book as being genre. Well, maybe I wouldn't describe it to myself in those terms so much as it was mashing up different genres. But I think, I think sometimes when we get into the conversation of genre, we get, there's a lot of hesitancy about it because, there's a long tradition of certain genres being kept out of the, so-called literary canon, and these kind of barriers put up, and snobbery and all of that. But if we're wiping all that away, to me, I think of genres as very interesting artistic traditions. And a lot of the joy of writing for me is figuring out how I can be in conversation. Or maybe that's another way. I think of it as like conversations, right? I think of literature as some great conversation in some infinitely large ballroom, some Borgesian ballroom. And then in that large conversation, different groups get together and talk in different ways. And that's like a genre. And getting to talk in multiple genres is speaking in different conversations and figuring out how to speak to those different traditions in that way. And so I think the genres are very beautiful in that way. And I really like, if we're not thinking of them in snobbery ways, but thinking of them as these conversations and traditions that we get to participate in, I find that really inspiring. And from a creative point of view, for whatever reason, my brain very much works in a kind of manner where constraints really help me. I really was inspired by the Lippian group, which are these French writers who use really rigid constraints to write their texts. An example of that, the most famous example of that, is Georges Perec's A Void, which is written entirely without using the letter E. So there's no words in it that contain the letter E. And whenever it gets translated into another language, they skip whatever letter is the most common in that language. Anyway, that's an extreme version. But my brain works well with those kind of constraints. And so when I was writing my novel, it was a cyberpunk book on one level for me. It was a noir book on another level. And it was partly a sports book. And then my brain was like, how do I connect those dots, right? Where do I have a cyberpunk conceit get twisted a little bit through, a noir or a sports kind of lens? And I don't know if it makes it fresh for the genre, but it makes it fresh for me as a writer. That's how I feel like, I'm doing something a little different. I'm coming up with some different concepts by triangulating between these genre points.
But that's half the battle, is keeping it fresh for the readers, but also keeping it fresh for yourselves as as writers. Samit, Malka, or Sheree, do you have anything to add to this?
I was just thinking about what about your other novel, Lincoln?
Well, I only have one
What's
novel
your
out.
collection?
My other book was a story collection.
Okay. All right.
But I think about, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the story that you edited for me, Sheree, and FNSF was like another example of that. It was like a haunted house story, but with a community in which they were like, these developers were bringing in haunted houses to like and creating a development of all haunted houses. And so when I was writing that, a lot of it was thinking about how my father was a real estate agent growing up. So he like took me around to lots of properties. So a lot of it was just how do I mash up the concepts of real estate with haunted house tropes, and you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
The real
you had a
estate
lot of
market is
fun with
haunted.
it. I love that story.
Well, I
Yeah.
love reading everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, well, Samit, I'll toss it to you. I would like to just to kind of wind this down to get each of you to tell me your hopes for the future of near future science fiction. We've talked a lot about the staying power and things like that, but I'm curious for you personally, are there any trends that you see blossoming now that you want to see more of? Are there things that you would like to see more of that you don't see at all? That kind of thing.
I think my hope is that it becomes possible for near future fiction, science fiction writers to not get depressed while doing their research. Because researching my near future science fiction book was a harrowing experience for me. I can only imagine it's the same for anyone who's going really deep down into any research rabbit hole for their near future stuff. I think what I'd like to see, and it ties in actually to what you were saying about genre blending, is that I really want near future SF to be a very rapidly evolving and very fluid genre, because genre itself shouldn't be static. My understanding of genre is also something that comes from the outside, in the sense that because of cultural and distance challenges, let's say, I never really understand what genre is, because it's never fixed for me, even the more supposedly classically defined ones. And I find it a big problem when genre is used as a term that excludes any form of literature, as opposed to being a vague description that includes more forms of literature, right? So having written a book that was described as literary fiction in India, and then science fiction, and then when it moved to North America was called dystopian and cyberpunk. I have achieved no clarity on what genre I write in myself. But I like all of it. Like, I like the book being described as anything that anyone describes it as, that enables them to like it and include it and read it without reservation. And I think the sheer mind-boggling diversity of futures that it's possible for people to imagine. And I hope their work finds this resting place where people aren't bringing filters of exclusion to them. So I want this genre to be one of absolute open-mindedness, which is also the best way to see whatever future you're seeing through whoever's lens.
Because the future is open, and everyone who's living right now, we should be open-minded about the future in general. Yeah, not just in fiction. I love that, Samit. Malka, what about you?
Yeah, the same. I mean, as a reader, particularly, what I want is, I want different things at different times. Sometimes I want a mystery. Sometimes I want something cozy. Sometimes I want a romance. Okay, fine. All of which could be in the near future. I am not. And so what I really want is for people to keep writing, and for people to keep writing lots of different things. Because what I really dislike as a reader typically is when I'm reading something and I'm like, yeah, I've read this one before. I don't really like the stories that kind of, and you can subvert stuff, and you can take something and play with it and do amazing things. But when it's sort of the same shape of the story and the same type of hero, I think we all know, that's what really turns me off from reading. So what I want is more writing, more different things, more different kinds of books, mixing all the genres in different ways and different combinations. And what Samit just said, just lots of different futures out there, because again, if we think about the use case or the purpose or the bigger reason for this, it should be to open up as many futures as we as humanity can imagine, because that's what our imagination is for. It's to give us lots and lots and lots of options, and lots of frameworks for dealing with things as they happen, and also lots of fun and entertainment and enjoyment. And so I think, my hopes for the near future sci-fi is just lots more from lots of different people, lots of different places.
Don't bore Malka. Give some
Don't
variety.
bore me. Absolutely.
And Victor, what about you?
For me, I mean, just to echo what Samit and Malka said, like a bigger umbrella for near future sci-fi, definitely 100%. But I'm going to go a little more specific here because our culture is dominated by superhero movies. And I really would like, especially now in this like Marvel phase, whatever we're on, that deals with like quantum physics. I really want that kind of energy and excitement that the culture seems to give to superhero movies, especially in terms of like quantum physics, to also be redirected to stories about, a quantum entanglement, the way we can communicate, quantum computing, because I think those are going to be very important issues that we're going to be talking about for a while. I mean, right now we're talking about AI art, for example, is related to just quantum physics in general. I think the public interest can be there, and if we're saying that for better or worse, the superhero movies and genre is now our modern myths. I wish that we can kind of take some of that energy and attention into stories about these very cutting edge technologies that's going to affect our lives and is already affecting our lives on a daily basis. But yes, diversity, of course. But yeah, that's very kind of specific because I'm also super interested in that right now.
Yeah, right on. And for anyone who wants a different take on superheroes, Samit's got a little something for you. You got a couple books, don't you? Turbulence and can't remember the name.
Resistance.
Yeah. So go check those out if you want a little bit of a twist on superheroes.
Thanks.
And Sheree, what about you in terms of your hopes for the future of near future sci-fi, things that you'd like to see, trends that are just starting now, or things that you're seeing blossom that you want to see go farther?
I read so I can travel when I can't travel. So I'm really, really into like reading stories from other cultures, places, especially places I've been curious. They're on my bucket list. And that was the fun thing about editing the Africa or co-editing the African Risen anthology, because I got a chance to be in the imaginations of all of these different writers who are around the world, right? And so I guess for me, we've been doing it for a while, but I want to see it on a larger level and not just treat it as this kind of little flashy trend. I want to see more futures from places that, and from written by the people from those places in their voices, that shows them in the future that's a thriving future, perhaps, and they have other problems, right? And imagine what those other problems might be. That's what I'm excited about. So like the more that we can spread this beautiful genre love and empower, support, give buzz to do reviews of them, talk to them, put them on podcasts, like big up these people from places that we normally did not see in our community as science fiction writers, often being written about by others, but not from themselves. So I'm very excited and interested in that. With editing the magazine Fantasy Science Fiction, which you can subscribe to, keep print alive, keep print alive. I'm so happy to get stories from all over the world, right? And it reminds me, it keeps me from being stale in my own thinking of what's possible. It expands my imagination and what the human experience is in these different kind of contexts. So that would be super cool to have that be a thing, right? And not just a trendy thing for whatever month it is, or you know what I mean? Indigenous futures, I mean, right here in the heart of Quetzalcoatl's, arrival out of this mountain. I think this is the mountain in which the god was supposed to have emerged. I'm, hearing and seeing the Nahuatl language all over the place, and being aware that these cultures, people have living cultures, and they're not just things in our in our little research loop. Like they're live, living, thriving cultures that are moving and changing with society. What do people have to say about what they look like in the future? What do their, how do you hold on to certain things? What do you let go, right? That's the kind of thing I'm very curious about. How do we reconcile the stuff that maybe isn't so great for us, and it's still a part of our psyche? How do you reconcile that in this new context? So yeah, more of that. I'm really excited about that.
Beautiful. Diversity of experience breeding more diversity of thought.
Yeah, so I can travel for free in your book.
Help Sheree travel by subscribing to Fantasy and Science Fiction Magazine. Lincoln, my friend, close this out.
Oh, well, I guess I might as well close it out by echoing what everyone else said. To be like slightly more specific, but this dovetails into what everyone said. When you first asked this question, the first thing I thought about was that I, in an American context, would love to see a lot more translated near future science fiction being published. So if any editors or publishers are out there, I think, again, this is kind of echoing what everyone said, but, I always in general want to see, literature is about seeing different ideas and seeing through different eyes, and, near future science fiction, maybe especially. So I would, love to see more of that being translated and published here. I guess just to shout out a specific book along those lines that I was just reading was, or the most recent near future or sci-fi book that I just read was Yuri Herrera's 10 Planets. Yuri Herrera is like a great Mexican author who's got a book coming out on Grey Wolf that's kind of Borgesian science fiction stories. I thought they were quite good. But otherwise, I also agree with, I think it was Malka was saying, just more of everything. Mix out the genres, give us everything, make it weird, keep it bizarre.
Yes, make it weird. That is a good note to end on.
Yeah.
But Malka, Lincoln, Sheree, Victor, Samit, thank you all so much for kicking off TBRCon 2023 week with me. It means a lot. And for this invigorating discussion on near future sci-fi. Honestly, thank you so much. I'll go through each of you. If you could tell folks where they can find you on social media, and you can sell them on your book just for a brief moment. Victor, we'll start with you, buddy.
Sure. Hi. Again, my name is Victor Manibo. You can find me on Twitter at Victor Manibo and on victormanibo.com. My debut is The Sleepless. It's right here. It's got a really cool cover. Came out in August, and later this year I will have another sci-fi mystery from Erewhon Books called Upward. It's a high school reunion, kind of Knives Out set in a space station. So watch out for that.
Nice.
And also got those crazy themes of like wealth inequality and immigration. So it's going to be a lot of fun. A lot of the stuff that we were already talking about. Thank you for having me. This was such a fun conversation.
Pleasure, buddy. And where can people find you on social media?
Oh, I already mentioned that. At Victor Manibo on Twitter. Right.
All right, perfect. And Samit?
Hi, I'm Samit Basu. I'm at Samit Basu on every social media platform that might be collapsing right now, and every new one that's going to come in. I'm just going to be in there, bagging that username for whatever it is. My last novel was The City Inside, came out from draw.com summer 22. I have a book coming out October 23, which is called Jinbot of Shantipot, and which is a rampaging sci-fi adventure in a sinking city, and there are spaceships and there are robot monkeys and there's lots of fun. Thank you for having me. Yeah, speaking of plot, it's all it's based on Calcutta, where I now am. Thank you so much for having me. I just love being on this and talking to all of you.
Oh, my pleasure, buddy. And Lincoln, what about you?
I stupidly have a different handle on like every single social media network, but my Twitter is at the Lincoln, and I can't remember why I did that. Someone had taken Lincoln. I was like mad. I was like, okay,
I'm the Lincoln. Fuck you.
Well, now I used to just get all these messages at me with someone being like mad about like the Lincoln Theater or like some other place. But I'm there. I have a free to read kind of craft focused newsletter called Countercraft on Substack. And yeah, my novel, which came out in 2021, is The Body Scout. And yeah, this is a really fun panel. Thank you so much for having me. And
Thank
it
you
was
too.
really enjoyed talking with all of you.
Yeah. And Malka?
Yeah, so I also do not have the same handle everywhere, but I'm mostly on Twitter so far, and I'm at M_Older. I'm at Older on Mastodon, at Infomocracy on Instagram, which I'm trying to use more, and I hate it. And also at Narrative Disorder on Tumblr, which I enjoy, but I'm not very good at yet. So anyway, I'm relatively easy to find because of my name. And so you can also find my WordPress page where you can sign up for my newsletter, which I'm also trying to do more often because of freaking Twitter melting down. My next book, which is the novella, The Mimicking of Known Successes, which is a cozy gas punk murder mystery, FF sci-fi set on a gas giant planet, is coming out March 7th from Tor.com. And we just announced the sequel, which will come out a year later, I guess. And also my older books, Infomocracy, is on ebook sale this month. So go get it if you don't have it already. And thank you so much. I knew when I saw all the names on this was going to be an awesome panel, and I've enjoyed it so much.
Oh, thank you too. And Sheree?
Hey, I'm not so great on social media, but you can find me on IG at Sheree Renée Thomas or Facebook Sheree Renée.Thomas. But on Twitter, I'm at Black Pot Mojo because I did the same thing. My name was too long, so I just went with my other handle, Black Pot Mojo. And I'm excited about a couple of books. I had like 4 or 5 books come out last year. I either edited them or was in them, so I'm excited. Of course, you can read my very first novel ever.
Woo.
That I completed and didn't toss across the room, which is Black Panther, Panther's Rage. It is an adaptation of a novelization of the original comics. So that was pretty exciting. You can check out my Crazy Mind in 9 Bar Blues, which is my short story collections from Third Man Books. Black Panther is from Titan. Or you can read these amazing, brilliant writers in Africa Risen, which is,
Upside down.
Rise, the future must rise from the top, right? We must rise, which is a 54th NAACP Image Award nominee this year. So yay. Or send me funny notes. No bitching, just good love at FNSL.
Just good love, just good love.
And don't forget the memory librarian.
Yes. With
yes.
Janelle Monáe.
Janelle Monáe rocks.
She's awesome. All right, well, thank you 5 for hanging out with me and starting off this convention week. It was a blast, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you out there to everyone who's watching or who will watch in the future, being all meta and shit, watching in the near future. Thank you all so much, and take care.
Bye.